Hello, my friends. Mike Myers here with the Songwriting for Guitar podcast, episode number 28, Michelle Pettinato. Before we get into Michelle's amazing background, we're 28 episodes in. Have you left a review on Apple Podcasts yet? If the answer is no, take a few moments right now, hit the pause button, head on over, and tell me about your favorite episode. Because remember, every single review helps. That helps get this podcast out there more, aware of how amazing it is. All these guests that we've had, Frank Turner, Ali Moss, Jared Reddick, Keith Jeffries, the list goes on. So just take a few moments, leave us a review, because believe me, every single one helps. Now, Michelle has been a professional sound engineer for 30 years. The amount of artists she's worked with, Gwen Stefani, Goo Goo Dolls, Melissa Etheridge, Jewel, Indgio Girls, Elvis Costello. Her first tour was with the Spin Doctors in 1992. She has had a phenomenal journey, and her story is amazing because it just breaks the notion that you have to live in a music city, that you have to be there. She's defying it, she's doing it well, and she's helping others achieve better mixes with their sound. So if they want to start doing it, they can. So enough of me yammering on. We're going to jump into it. Episode number 28, Michelle Pettinato. I'm excited because you're a Pennsylvanian. As soon as we started, I was like, where are you from? And you were like, Scranton. I was like, oh, can we talk about the myth of you've got to be in a music city? Ugh. But before we get into all that jazz, I want to know, how did you get into, so you do a lot of mixing, a lot of engineering, but that process to me is fascinating, how you get into it. What was, when you were growing up, did you play any instruments, or what was kind of that kind of segue into that world?
Yeah. So I live in Scranton now. I've lived here for about 30 years, but I grew up in about as far away from the music business as you could get. I grew up in this tiny little coal town in East Central PA, population of about 4,000 people. So, and honestly, how I ended up with, where the desire to work in music and audio production came from, I have no idea, because no one in my family was in the music business even remotely. I didn't know anyone in the business. No one was musical. I started playing piano when I was a little kid, and I took lessons all through high school, but there was just no connection to anyone in the industry. And it was kind of one of those things where music was always really important to me. It was my passion. There was always music on at the house, records, radio. My mom had a really eclectic record collection of everything from, Elvis to John Denver to Kiss to Bach and Beethoven. I mean, it was just a little bit of everything. And I was just, always immersed in it, just playing records and listening to all different kinds of music. And music was kind of my escape growing up, it was just where things got bad. I'd go to my room and just, put my headphones on and listen and just kind of lose myself in it. So it was always just there in my life. And I think it was somewhere in high school, where you're trying to figure out what am I going to do when I grow up, and I didn't, it was one day, a light bulb went off. I wanted to be part of music, but I didn't want to be a performer. I played piano, but I just no way wanted to be on stage. I played for my church choir and the school chorus and stuff like that. And in situations where I wasn't the focal point, I was fine. But I could never just get up there and be like, oh, I'm going to do a piano solo. It was just no, I don't want the spotlight at all. But I remember, listening, when I was a teenager, listening to, there was two crucial records, Queen, Night at the Opera and A Day at the Races. And I remember just listening to those in my headphones, laying in bed thinking, how on earth did they make this? How did they make this sound like this? I mean, it sounds enormous, and it's just four guys. And, their records always said no synthesizers. And I'm like, well, how did they create these sounds? And it was fascinating to me. So somewhere in high school, I figured out, well, every record I had, I would always read the liner notes. This is back in the days of vinyl albums. And every record had this person called a recording engineer. And I didn't know what that was, but I knew they had to be important because they're on every single record. So I was just like, I'm going to be a recording engineer. I don't know what that is, but that's what I'm going to do. And then, I kind of looked into it, and it was like, oh, these are the people who actually record the music. And I thought, this is a way for me to be creatively involved with making music, but not have to be the performer, the musician. And that's kind of what started me down that path. But I mean, growing up in the tiny town that I did, when I told people I was going to be a recording engineer, they're like, "You're going to be a DJ?" I'm like, "No, I'm not going to spin records. I want to make records." And no one understood what that meant. This was the
Yeah.
80s, and you grew up. If you were a girl, you grew up, got married, started a family, and if you wanted a job, you worked at the mall. And if you were a guy, you worked at a plant or a factory. That was it. Like that was the end of opportunity for that area. So it was a coal mining town, a lot of old, hardworking coal mining people, and no one really got my dream. So
That right there is, everything that you said was super interesting because I feel you listening to records. And as you said, there were so many Elvis, Bach, Kiss, the sonic palette in which you were given was all over the place.
yeah,
And it's just that to me is because then and you probably too, you agree when you're a teenager, I feel like those are influential years of when you're listening to music because it's like, it's your thing. It's like you absorb it completely. And that kind of gave you a palette of, oh, this sonic texture. What is this?
yeah,
And it's just like, how can you create this? And to, growing in a small town, to then be like, well, this is what it is. But then you kind of go like, but what if it's something else? What if I can do something else other than these two things that you're giving me right now?
right. Yeah, and that was, like I started looking into, because I was also the first in my family to have the opportunity to go to college, and
Mm-hmm.
and I was really smart in high school, like I was in the honor society and all that, and always the best grades, and so my mother was convinced I was going to go be a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. I was just like, no, going in the music business. So that was a huge battle, and it would basically became like everyone, I had no support from anybody. I had my friends thought I was crazy. My teachers in high school, my music teacher was like, well, why don't you go into music therapy? I'm like, because I don't want to be a therapist. I want to be I want to make records. My, guidance counselors, everybody was just like, you can't do that. That's not a real job. It's not a real career. So I went to college for a year majoring in music, and I had one music class the whole year. And I'm like, this is not going to get me it's not going to teach me what I need to know here. I'm not going to get where I want to be. So I found a little school in Ohio, the recording workshop, and they taught like a very basic recording engineering program. It was about a month long, and I went there. And so after that, and it was great, like it was a lot of hands-on, and
Mm-hmm.
I learned the basics because I was coming from knowing nothing. So I got a fairly decent grip on what goes on in the studio. But from there, I went to work at a radio station for a bit. And then I had a cousin who was living in Nashville, and she invited me to come down there to stay with her and try and get a job. So I took a bus to Nashville and spent 3 weeks walking around Music Row and just knocking on every single studio door I could find, and asking for a job, and handing out my little tiny resume of the recording workshop in WMGH, and just being like, no clue that I still had no idea what I was doing or how to get into the business. And, and everywhere I went, they're like, well, we're really not hiring. So I just realized I still don't know enough. I don't know how to get into this business. I don't really understand how it works. And I went back home, and shortly after that, I heard of Full Sail in Florida, Full Sail, and I enrolled there. And it was when I was in Full Sail that I switched from recording engineering to live sound, because it never even occurred to me, even though I'd gone to tons of concerts, that you could actually mix music on tour, that never even
Yeah.
occurred that it was a job. So when I took my live sound course, I was just like, oh wait, so I could get paid to mix music and travel the world. It was just like, this is a done deal. I mean, this is me. Like that's what all that I've ever wanted to do. So, but like when I got to Full Sail, it was funny because everyone in my life up to that point was just like, this is crazy. This is a crazy idea. You need to get a real job. You need to go back to school and get a degree. And when I got to Full Sail, it was the first time people were actually like, yeah, you can do this. And I felt like I had the support of a community of people who were like, it's not crazy. This is, what we do. And this is how we can help you get there. And
Yeah.
it was great, and I immediately after I graduated, I started working at a little sound company. And now, and it is kind of, you do have to kind of live where there's work. So that's the one thing where I couldn't move back home because there was no live sound industry. There was no studios. There was no work in music whatsoever. So I worked in Philly for a while. And After that, I moved back to Florida and I worked at a bunch of nightclubs. And at one point I had like 3 jobs. I was working in 2 different, like a nightclub and a entertainment facility and for a local sound company. I was just basically taking every job I could get in audio. And I knew like eventually I wanted to get on tour, but until that, I'm just going to do any job in audio that I can do till, to keep learning and gaining some skills.
That early, if I can backtrack to when you were in Ohio
Mm-hmm.
and you were doing that, what kept you going to when, you had counselors, you had teachers, family, they were just like, you can't do this. What kept that going? Because I feel some people, when they're met with that opposition, it kind of gets to them. It kind of like eats away, where eventually that thing that's the spark that dwindles out because they're met with such resistance.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's hard. I think it's 2 things. It's one, like this was a passion and it was so deeply ingrained in me. Like music was like, I have to do something with music. This was, from a young age, it was a very strong passion. But the other thing was, I kind of had the attitude when people said you can't do this, I would just be like, well, watch me. It was just kind of a little bit of a cockiness and like this was my driving passion. Like I just couldn't see myself doing anything else. And I think that's important because, this business it's so hard to break into. And for a lot of people, once they do get into it, it doesn't really own up to what they expected it to be. Like their expectations aren't always met. And it's grueling. It's a difficult lifestyle, especially, touring sound, concert sound. It's, you're working 16, 18-hour days and in not great conditions and you're filthy and exhausted and sweaty and hot and, and you're getting on a bus and sleeping in a tube going down the highway at 80 miles an hour every night. It's just like, yeah, that's a dream job, right? So you have to have something that's driving you, to get through. And even just as you're building your career, as you're getting through the paying your dues part of it, whether you are a musician or a tech or whatever, there's a lot of paying your dues while you're cutting your chops and learning your skills. And if you don't have a passion that's really driving you, I don't see how you're going to make it through that period because it's tough. You've got to have that fire and that you're chasing after. Otherwise, it's just too easy to throw in the towel and say, I don't know why I'm doing this. This is too hard.
That fire is visible if you go to Nashville. And as you said, for 3 weeks, you're knocking on doors and every single person's like, no, nope. And it's like, well, okay, I got to rethink this. And it's just like, you go back to like, what's my next step?
Exactly.
How do I refocus this? So when you were, you were going in between, so you were working in Philly, then you were working in Florida. When did it make the move? When was your first, where you feel like your entryway into that live engineering? What was your first gig?
Well, I mean, I worked, my first real gig, my first tour was with the band Spin Doctors in 1992. And that's where I kind of felt like, okay, I'm finally on track here. I had done a lot of live mixing up to that point, but it was all local, at nightclubs and stuff. Mm-hmm. But yeah, a friend, it was actually, and this is another thing about like the business is it's the networking. Like you never know where the next job is going to come from. And the tour was offered to me by a classmate who, from Full Sail, like a guy that we became friends while we were in Full Sail. And he knew how badly I wanted to go on tour. And he was on this tour. He needed someone to replace him and he offered it to me, and it was just the right time at the right moment, or the right place at the right time, because I started with them and a month after I began, their album just hit Billboard Top 100 and they just took off and it exploded. So, it was just like a great entry level for me into touring. And, it was just a great, exciting time for the band and for me. And yeah, it couldn't have happened any better.
How do you navigate through live mixing? Because I feel it's one thing sitting in your chair in a studio and sitting there and it's quiet. And then you're just like, oh, I'll tweak this here and there. But like live mixing, that feels like a completely different animal.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure. But to me, it was kind of, once I started getting into live, I was just like, I did some studio stuff in between and I was just like, oh my God, this is I can't work on the same line of this song for 2 weeks. This is crazy, But there's like, to me, I kind of thrive on that pressure. Like you have to get it right because there's no redoing it, and it's funny, like when you look back over your career, you see the lessons and the things that happened that made you ready for the next thing that came, that you don't see when you're in it. But when I started working for the Spin Doctors, I did one show. I mixed a club show, and the next day we started the Horde tour, which was like a hippie jam band tour, festival tour, like Bella Fleck and Blues Traveler, all these, the same kind of genre of bands. And we were, I think, like the third or fourth band on the main stage. So this is back in analog days. There was no digital consoles. Everything was analog desks and no saving your file and starting from that. So we didn't get a sound check. We basically had 20 minutes to roll our stuff on stage, wire everything up, and just tap through the mics real quick in the headphones to make sure they were all plugged in right, and then go. And that really taught me, like, it was trial by fire. It was like, okay, learn how to pull a mix together in one song, because that's what you got, because the set's only 30 minutes long. So you can't take 30 minutes, sorting out drum sounds, So it was really great, because it taught me how to do that. Like, it really taught me how to pull a mix together really quick, what's important in the mix and what's not, and what to focus on to get it sounding the way it should in a short amount of time.
That's interesting. You said what's important and what's not important. What in that sort of scenario where it's kind of like, I've got to go, like it's now. What do you focus on? What are the core things that, to you, if you were doing that on the fly, what is your ear listening for?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is like getting your gain structure right, right from the start. Because if you've got good instruments and good players, if you've got good gain going into your preamp, that's half the battle right there. You just usually need to bring up the faders, and you've got a great place to start with. But I would focus on, making all my sure my gain levels were correct. And then drums and vocals, because the kick and snare is kind of the backbeat. And as soon as people can't hear the vocals, that's the first thing you're going to get complaints about. So just make sure that's, clear as day, and your guitar is filling around it. Once I would sort out the vocals, making sure that they were clear and they sounded good, then I would focus on building a drum mix and getting drums dialed in, because they usually take the most work. Guitars and bass, you can usually just bring them up and without any EQ, they sound at least okay. They don't sound terrible. And, keyboards and stuff like that, you can usually just bring that up, and as long as you can hear them, they're good. Whereas drums, drums usually need a little bit of work to sound good over the PA. So once drums are dialed in, I make sure the bass is sitting well with the drums, and then, guitar, keyboards, whatever else is there, making sure that lead instruments are heard. And then when I have a good mix going, then I'll focus on adding effects. But effects, like there's always, to me, if you've got a good mix, you don't need effects. And if you have a bad mix and you add effects, it just makes a bad mix worse. So I always kind of leave that to the end.
Oh, I feel like you said, especially taking drums, I feel like every single band that I was in, that was always in a live check. Drums were the longest. High tom, tone,
Yeah.
tone, low tom. And then it was just like guitar, do, you're good. And it was like, okay.
Yeah.
But to me, that's also cool. The idea that if you have a bad mix, no matter how cool the effect is, I don't know, it's like icing a rock. It's just like, yeah, the icing's great, but it's still rock.
Yeah.
It's still going to be terrible.
Yeah. And that's, unfortunately, like I see this is an issue these days with, so many plugins. Like there's so many great plugins out there, and I see a lot of people get gadget happy instead of focusing on building their mixing chops, and learning how to EQ and learning how to set gain and get good sounds. They're just trying to cover up problems with more effects and more compression and more this and more that. And you need to have a good mix before you start adding all that stuff, because like you said, it just covers it up and makes it worse. It doesn't fix anything.
It's almost like you're saying, learn the core, like the foundational things. Yeah. And all those, because there's so many, like, I get emails daily of just like, this is from Waves, this is from UAD. Yeah. And it's just like, there's so many plugins. And you can get like plugin happy, where you're like, oh, I've got to get this and this and this. But there's like, I can open my computer and there's a core of plugins that I haven't even touched.
Right.
I've probably bought that I'm just like, I don't even know what that does. Like, what does this do?
Yeah. Well, here's a perfect example. Like I'll do a lot of talking to students and classes and stuff. And I always get that question, like, well, what plugins do you own? And I shock people when I tell them I don't own any. Like I do all my mixing with the desk. Like I strictly use what's on the desk, and I use the right tool for the job. And no plugins. because the biggest thing is I think coming from the analog world, same thing, before plugins, you just add more and more pieces in your signal path. And, there's always, the more you add, the more problems that can arise. The more room there is for problems. So I was always of a less is more, just use what I need, use the right tool instead of adding a bunch of stuff to fix the problem with the wrong tool. And then you have less of a chance of things going bad. And then, you're spending less money too. It doesn't cost you anything. And it just kind of carried over from analog days. So if I have a situation where what I have is not, there's a problem that I need something to solve it, then I'll add a plugin. But I personally own no plugins. I just use what's on the console.
You've done pretty well, because I'm looking as an independent engineer, you've done things with Indgio Girls, Jewel, Gwen Stefani, Kesha. I mean, Goo Goo Dolls. That is a wide variety, just like your your mom's record collection. I feel like that's not one particular style. It's it shows the versatility of a good, mixing engineer.
Well, and it's funny too, because, my background in mixing has mostly been rock and pop and folk. I haven't done I did country when I was working for sound companies and stuff like that. But my touring experience has all been mostly rock and pop. But, that also is a wide variety. There's punkish pop, and then there's, mainstream pop, and then there's, folk rock. And so, but you'll be surprised at how many people think that because you mix, when I worked for Indgio Girls for about 8 years, and you kind of get typecast into this, she just mixes chicks with acoustic guitars. And for years, I kept getting, if it was a girl pop singer or a girl with a guitar, I got called for it. And I'm like, all I want to do is mix rock. And, I grew up on 80s metal. That was my thing. And that's kind of, this is what I wanted to do when I started mixing. And I had to fight for years to break out of that stereotype of, Michelle mixes chicks with guitars. I'm like, no, I want to mix a rock band. And it was funny because my friend, fellow engineer Randy Lane, had been mixing the band Fuel for years. And we used to, he was like, God, and he mixed a couple of the G3 tours, with Satriani and Steve Vai and that kind of thing. And we would lament to each other. He's like, I'm so sick of mixing electric guitars. I'm like, I'm so sick of mixing acoustic guitars. And sure enough, about at some point, he called me up and he was like, hey, Mr. Big is looking for a sound engineer. I'm like, oh my God, you're kidding me. It's like, I talk about rock idols. And, and I finally, I got the job, and it was my most favorite tour ever. But it's, you get, people kind of tend to think that you can only do one thing. And the truth is, if you can listen, if you know how to listen and hear, you can mix anything, because it's all about listening to the music and dissecting it and understanding how it goes together. It's not about, she can only mix country, or this guy can only mix, rap, or it's just being able to listen correctly.
What you're saying being stereotyped, I heard Butch Walker talk about in his early days of producing bands. He had some hit singles with people, and he was like, all I was getting was Avril type style people all the time. They were just like that. Oh, that's what he does. He was like, that's not what I do. I can do a lot of different, I just write songs and I just produce songs. I can do a lot more than just this.
Yeah.
Oh, and then you went on to found soundgirls.org. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, I started probably in the late 80s was when I started working in live sound. And at that time, there were very few women on tour and very few women in live sound, period. But when I started touring, one of the only other women that I knew was Carrie Keyes, who was the monitor engineer for Pearl Jam. And I think at the time she was working for the Chili Peppers. And it was kind of strange because the Spin Doctors and Chili Peppers, Pearl Jam were all kind of the same genre, not genre, but in the same circles, but we never ever crossed paths. And we knew of each other for all this time, but we never ever met until 2012. We were asked to speak on a panel at the AES show. And it was 5 women in a live sound. Jerry Palumbo, who's a broadcast engineer, does the Super Bowl and NFL, ESPN stuff, and Claudia Engelhardt, who is the tour manager and sound engineer for Bill Frisell, Deanne Franklin, who'd done a bunch of stuff like Spearhead, Sonic Youth, and Carrie and myself. And we had all met for the first time 5 minutes before this panel. And all of us had been working in live sound for, 20 plus years. And we were just kind of like, how did we how do we not even know of each other, let alone having never met before? So we just kind of had such a great experience on this panel. Like, just, we really bonded. And after it was over, we kind of, the conversation kind of kept going, like, how nice would it have been had we known each other throughout our careers, to have that friendship of other women in this business to fall back on, just that support. And, and like, the business is male dominated, but I've had an incredibly positive experience. Like, it's never been an issue for me. Sexism does exist, but it's never held me back. But there are definitely things that women face in life, with children and taking care of elderly parents, and things that men don't usually deal with. And when you're on the road, it's kind of, there's different challenges. So we just talked about how it would have been nice to have someone who understands what you're dealing with. And I had also been trying to find a way to reach out to young women and show them that, look, you don't have to be a guy to do this, because I didn't have that when I was starting out. Like, everyone told me I couldn't, not because I was a woman, but just because this isn't a real job. And I wanted to let young women know that you don't have to settle for a traditional female career if that's not for you. Like, these are potential careers. You can, if you're creative, if you want to be involved in music, but you don't want to be a performer, this is an option. So Carrie and I just kind of started this conversation, and that's where, it led to Sound Girls. So we could just kind of reach out to the next generation, and give them the support that, they need to get into this business, if that's what they desire, kind of make it a little bit easier for them than it was for us, and, do whatever we can to help.
I love that, because it's not only are you doing the thing, but you're going to others to get them to start thinking about, like, well, maybe I can do that too. And you're going like, hell yeah, you can do that. You absolutely can. And I think in that space, because you also have an online course, that when it's one thing, when people are hearing like, oh, this is how you do the thing, and it's teachers, they think of higher education and just like, here are the things. But to have people in the middle of doing it, like, actually with the experience and knowledge, and like, not only am I teaching you this thing, but I'm actively doing it right now as we speak.
Right.
That is a completely different set of teaching, because that's like right in the middle of doing it, instead of that formal style. This is the space of kind of like alternative education that I think is fantastic.
Yeah, and the cool thing is too, with Sound Girls and with my course, we offer a lot of shadowing opportunities. So, while I'm on tour, I'll post, this is where I'm going to be. These are the cities, and if women or anyone wants to come out and shadow me for the day, just to see, if you're thinking that you might want to do this, come out and see what it's really like, and so that's a really, it's really cool when you have people come out and just have like their eyes open to the, not just audio, but all the different possibilities of roles on tour. And just, to see like, wow, like I could do that, or I thought I wanted to do this, but that looks really cool. Like I might want to be a video director, or, so it's really cool having that interaction with people who are just kind of trying to find their way into the business, and giving them the opportunity to come out and really see what goes on. Because I had, even, up until I did my first tour, I had no idea what happened on tour. I didn't know how a day, progressed. You think what happens, but you don't really have any clue until you actually start getting out there and doing it.
That's phenomenal, because I feel I learned the most when I shadowed someone.
Yeah.
When I was just watching it. It's one thing hearing about it, reading it on paper, watching a video, but to experience it and be present and watching it happen, it's completely different game, because it's like, oh, that's interesting. Why did they do that?
Yeah.
And it's like, you can just be like, can I ask you, why did you do that thing right there? Because it made a huge difference, but I have no idea why. And it's like, oh yeah, sure. It's because, it's that just added to their little fact bank in their head, and they store that away.
Yeah, and those are my favorite days. Is like when I get the kids who actually have really well thought out questions. Like they don't want to just come out there and lurk in the shadows. They have put some thought into, like, this is what I want to know. This is what I'm struggling with, and how do you handle this, and how do you deal with this? And I love those days when it's actually like a teaching experience, when you can share your knowledge and just say, well, that's one way you could do it, but here's another way. And they're like, oh my God, I never even thought about it, And
Now, your ebook that you have, the 5 biggest mistakes you're making with EQ.
Mhm.
How do you boil it down to 5?
Well,
Because I'm sure you could go, here's many more.
yeah. Well, that's the thing. Like, first of all, EQ is something that really mystifies a lot of people. And that came about, from just when I talk to students and, different people who are getting started in audio and mixing. One of their biggest fears and challenges is knowing how to use EQ correctly.
Now, how would you describe EQ to someone that is maybe like, I have no idea what you're talking about recording? What is like a basic description of what EQing would be?
So EQ is the manipulation of frequencies, and frequencies are the sounds that we hear. It's just that you have sounds that are high pitched and sounds that are low pitched, and every tone is its own frequency. So with EQ, what you're doing is you're basically adding or taking away specific frequencies in either the mix or an instrument, to manipulate it to get the effect that you want, to get something to sound the way you want, or to clean up problems. Like if you ever are at a concert and you hear feedback, that horrible noise coming, like a shrill squeal coming through the PA, that's a frequency, and you get rid of that by cutting that frequency with EQ. You can make instruments sound warm and full, or sound thin and harsh and bright. You can completely alter and change the sound of an instrument by manipulating frequencies with EQ.
Then how do you boil it down to 5? Because that to me is a vast array of different possibilities that you could do sonically with your mix.
Yeah. So, the thing with EQ is that there are some rules. EQ is probably the best tool that you can use for crafting a great sounding mix. And there are rules for how to use it properly. And one of the biggest things is people think that, oh, well, I'll just keep adding, frequencies. Like if my vocal needs to be brighter, I'll just add some high frequencies. But you're actually, when you're doing that, you're adding some level to your signal, which could drive it into clipping if it's not done correctly. So there are certain ways to use EQ, and there are certain rules that make up the foundation of what you should do and how you should use it. And there are certain things too that, very simple things you can do with EQ that can create huge changes in a sound or in a mix that can be beneficial, that a lot of people don't know. So they tend to use EQ the wrong way, or they miss, applying it in certain ways that can make, a world of difference in what they're doing.
I think that's phenomenal. So if folks want to get their hands on this, where can they get this book? Because this is wonderful.
Yeah, they can find it at mixingmusiclive.com.
Excellent. And you have an online course as well.
I do.
Which I think is phenomenal, because especially now is the time to put things into practice and start to, like, if you're curious about this is the perfect avenue to start going down.
Yeah. And the online course is called Listen, Master the EQ Techniques of the Pros to Create Brilliant Mixes. And that came from, like I said, like just a lot of students, telling me how they just don't understand EQ. Like they know what it's supposed to do, but they really don't know how to use it. And also from a lot of my musician friends who have been, taking this time to record their own music. Like, well, it's COVID. I can't do anything else. Yeah. So I'm going to get my home studio going and start, recording all these songs I've been wanting to. But when it comes to mixing them, they're just like, I don't know where to start, and they're getting gear happy. They're buying all this equipment that they think is going to give them a great mix. And then after they spend all this money, they're like, well, it still sounds like crap. And I don't know why. And like, because you're missing the point, you need to start with the EQ first. And so I just kind of wanted to put that knowledge out there, because I think a lot of people go about it the wrong way. It's like, well, what can I buy or what can I add on here to fix something that can be easily, fixed with EQ? And EQ is part of every DAW, and it's the most basic. It's on every mixer, every soundboard. It's something that's sort of free. You don't have to spend any extra money on it, and it is the best tool for improving mixes.
I'm huge into watching the Great British Baking Show, and I feel like terrible mixes are the equivalent of like Paul and Prue being like, that has a soggy bottom. that is not good. It's just like,
yeah.
But I think that is wonderful. And Michelle, I really appreciate you taking the time, because your background is inspirational. I think for a lot of people, you really debunked a lot of myths that you kind of have to live in a music city, that you got to keep on pursuing your goals. Even when sometimes people go like, nope, I don't think you can do it. If you believe that you can do it and you start searching those avenues and you keep going, you keep knocking on doors, you can do the thing that you really enjoy the most.
Yeah, I mean, perseverance is huge. You're going to hear a lot of no's before you get to that yes, but all you need is one yes. And I love the story about Colonel Sanders when he was, going around the country trying to sell his famous chicken recipe. I think he heard no about 1,000 times before someone finally bought, the Kentucky Fried Chicken recipe. And look where he is today. So what if he would have given up after 10 no's? You just got to keep going, because eventually, I just look at it as those no's are not where I'm supposed to be. So that's just pushing me to find the place that I am supposed to be, which is that person who says yes.
Hey, songwriters, can I be honest? Your dynamics in your songs are awful. You're kind of like that loud talker in a restaurant. Everyone's looking at you and they're a little annoyed. You can do way better, and you know it. You should be controlling your guitar, not the other way around. So here's what I want you to do. Go to songwritingforguitar.com and head on over to the free mini course, Audience Engaging Dynamics. In that course, you're going to learn how to control your playing, start to create distinction between your sections, verse, choruses, bridge. You can use this to your advantage. Your songs will improve. Your co-writers will notice it, and the people that listen to your music, they will too. So remember, go to songwritingforguitar.com and click Audience Engaging Dynamics. That does it for this week's episode. It was edited and produced by Chris Fafalius. I'm Mike Myers. Thanks for listening.